You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast. The hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. It's Voss here from thechrisvossshow.com. There you go, ladies and gentlemen. The Iron Lady sings that makes it official. Welcome to the big show. We certainly appreciate you guys being here. Thanks for tuning in as always. We have the most amazing guests on the show, and I'm excited for our guests that we have today. The CEOs, the billionaires, the White House presidential advisors, the people who bring you the Pulitzer Prize-winning books and authors, and all the amazing ideas, the great journalists from all the different CNN, Bloomberg. Today, we have all the different journalists who come on the show and share their stuff. You're always going to learn on the Chris Voss Show. And what we do ask you is that you go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, share your family, friends, and relatives. Go to youtube.com/Chris Voss, linkedin.com/Chris Voss, and all those crazy places on the internet. Today we have an amazing journalist on the show. Kurt Wagner joins us for his new book. This has been getting a lot of salacious press, as it were, and for the dig that he did in the journalism world of finding out all the secrets that came out about this. The book is called The Battle for the Bird. Jack Dorsey, Elon Musk, and the $44 billion fight for Twitter's soul. Came out February 20th, 2024. Kurt Wagner is an award-winning business and technology journalist covering social media for Bloomberg, where he has worked since 2019. He's been covering social media since 2013 and has spent years writing about Twitter and its impact on society. He previously worked at the influential tech outlets Recode, Mashable, and Fortune. He grew up in Seattle, went to college at Santa Clara University, and now lives in Denver with his family. There you go. Welcome to the show, Kurt. How are you?
Hey, I am great. Thank you for that nice intro. You got all the stuff in there. Appreciate it.
Well, you know, it's your bio, so I was just reading.
It is my bio. Yeah, I know. I could have sent you like, hey, I'm Kurt. I work at Bloomberg. That would have been faster.
I do have a lot of people like my intro, the energy that goes into it. And they're like, hey, can we hire you just to walk around and introduce us everywhere? Like every time we enter a room, kind of like the president. Hear ye, hear ye.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Kurt, give us your .coms. Where can people find you on the interwebs?
Yeah, I'm on what was formerly Twitter, now X, at Kurt Wagner 8. I'm on Threads. I'm on LinkedIn. Obviously, I'm writing at Bloomberg quite regularly, so you can kind of find me on all those places. There
you go. So give us a 30,000 overview. What's your new book, Battle for the Bird?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the headline sort of captures it. I mean, this is the story of Elon's acquisition of Twitter, the fight that ensued, the summer of 2022, where they were going at each other legally over this thing. Mm-hmm. But, it's really a story that's bigger than that, right? I start the story actually several years before Elon even shows up, because I think there's a lot of really important stuff that happened in the lead up to this acquisition that people either aren't aware of or maybe need to be reminded of. So, I'd say this is really the story of Twitter. It's the story of how we got to where we are now with, Elon sort of being the cherry on top there.
There you go. And do you cover, how far back do you go in the origins of Twitter? Where do you start? Roughly? It starts in 2015 when CEO Jack Dorsey returns to the company. He was the co-founder. He'd previously been CEO. There's a few, details from, kind of flashbacks, if you will, from before that. But really my version of this story is Jack's return in 2015 through about the first, I'll say 2 to 3 months of Elon's takeover of Twitter. There you go, and you evidently even covered why he decided to do it and how he got into it and all that good stuff. What was it that drew you to the story? Why did you according to your bio, you've been writing about Twitter for a long time, but what was it that really drew you to it and said, hey, I want to write a book on this?
Yeah, well, I'd wanted to write a book about Twitter for a while. It's actually kind of a funny story. Because I'd covered it so long, I always thought it was like an incredibly influential, service. There were obviously the Trump years, right, where it was sort of like took on this new life of its own as the megaphone for a sitting U.S. president. And I was out pitching publishers like, hey, I want to write this like Twitter Jack Dorsey book. And Elon showed up on the scene as I'm talking to publishers. He literally, the meetings are being like derailed by, Elon showing up. And it was just only natural, of course, that you would sort of follow the story, right?
Huh.
He just made it so much more interesting. So I was able to keep sort of the first half of the book is probably more of my original premise. And then the second half was just like, it was unfolding as I was writing the book. And I was just sort of going where the story went.
I was one of the early users on Twitter. I was in the top 1,000 early on in 2008, 2009.
2006.
And I figured out, I didn't get on until 2008. But I figured out how to game it very early on and build a following. And at one point, there was a group of us that were like, because they only had 40 people back then. And for some reason, I believe it was Ev thought 40 people was the max that it should ever have. and so there were at least one fight that I caused by working with what's his face from Union Square Partners to tell them what I was seeing in the marketplace, because they were suspending so many people. I'm like, there is no trust left with corporates in your thing. And when Jack Dorsey came back with his little cucumber fucking you just look at it and just be like, when does this company ever make a profit? So
it's got a colorful history, to say the least, right? I mean, I think what people don't realize is that the cultural influence of Twitter is so dramatically, so much larger than the business ever was, right? Like people often lump Twitter in with Facebook or YouTube or whatever as being these like hugely significant social platforms. But from a business standpoint, it was minuscule compared to those other ones. And to me, it's just like, I think it's important for people to sort of know that, because I think that fact actually plays into a lot of, Twitter's story, right? Which is that it was always sort of an underdog, even though it sort of played in this bigger arena. It was never really belonged there as a business. And I think that's sort of been part of the story for them.
Yeah. And you heard about the fights that Ev and Biz and it was like the Three Stooges. It was Fred Wilson of Union Square Partners.
That's right.
I emailed him some stuff, and he writes me back and he goes, "Yeah, we just had an emergency board meeting over your whole letter, and I sent your letter to him." And I'm like, that wasn't for public purpose. And I caused one of those famous fights that have been written about at least once. And so you go through this thing and you started out and you profile something I guess was kind of secret, the Disney acquisition, where Mark Benioff and Bob Iger were interested in buying it. Tell us a little bit about that you tease out in the book.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite kind of chapters of the book, and it's several years old at this point, but I just it's interesting. So in 2016, Twitter, if you might remember, they were going through this like pivot as a company to live. Like they were doing NFL streams, they were doing like TV shows online. They were really trying to sort of be like a digital TV. And that summer, Mark Benioff at Salesforce approached them about a deal. And shortly after that, Bob Iger at Disney approached them about a deal. And suddenly they have like two real companies that are interested. So they're like, well, we need to run a process here, right? We need to make sure we're getting the best price. And so they kind of go out, they talk to everyone you can imagine. And they ultimately come back and they're like, oh, we're with the original two guys who started this whole thing. Those are the only two real serious ones. And they expected formal offers from both companies. And like the day they were supposed to be turned in, both companies walked away. And Twitter, is sort of left sitting there thinking, they're going to go one of two directions. And here they are, like with nobody. And, the one thing that I did kind of tease out that I hadn't ever read before was that Disney in particular ended up coming back to the table for a very short time. So they got really close. They walked away. Twitter basically went, and pitched hard to bring them back to the table, which worked briefly. Disney gave them such a low ball sort of bid that they floated that, Twitter was like, well, it's too low to even entertain this thing. And they ended up going the other direction. But the reason I think it's important is like there was always this idea, especially when Elon showed up. Well, why doesn't Twitter just sell to Facebook? Why doesn't Twitter sell to Google? There's got to be another buyer out there. And they tried to do these things. Like they tried to find a buyer and they couldn't. And so I think it's important history to keep in mind as Elon shows up, because you kind of remember, well, this might have been their only option.
Yeah. It's funny. I predicted, and that's what I caused the fight over. I predicted that Facebook was going to win over getting the business over Twitter, and Twitter was going to ruin its reputation and trust in the marketplace. Because I would go do speaking engagements to talk about Twitter, and I'd be in front of whole companies, and I'd be like, "How many of you have been suspended by Twitter?" Or I would hear this, well, we've all been suspended by Twitter, and back then, it was just was just crazy and imbalanced. The fail whales and the thing, and how many people have their accounts completely blocked by Twitter? And I'm like, you guys are trashing with what you're doing, playing these games of blocking people and suspending people, with your stupid little, attitudes about, stuff. And, I think they suspended people for retweeting at one point. They didn't want to do retweets. And I'm like, you're just destroying any sort of trust value you have in the marketplace, and Facebook's going to win. And I was bloody right. Yeah. So you tell the story of how Elon starts coming in the picture and starts going down this pathway that ends up with him owning this thing. Give us the tease out, if you would, on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few theories here, right? So he shows up on Twitter's doorstep in sort of late March of 2022. He's now the largest shareholder, and they had no idea. He just sort of like appears, like, hey, LOL, here I am owning 10% of the company. But there's a few theories as to why he started building that stake in Twitter. And there's one that came out in a recent book by Walter Isaacson about Elon, which is essentially, he had too much money. He didn't know what to do with it. Like most rich guys, he was like, what do I love? Oh, instead of buying like a beach house in, Malibu, he's like, I'm going to, buy Twitter, which I love. So that's theory one. There's another interesting theory that I sort of explore slightly in my book, which is that he really hated this account on Twitter called Elon Jet. Elon Jet, it tracked his private plane, and it posted, when it took off and where it landed. And in January of 2022, he complained to Twitter CEO at the time, Parag Agrawal, and said, take this down. And Twitter, basically ignored him. They didn't do it. And a few weeks later, he starts buying Twitter shares. So,
you uncovered them. Yeah.
It's kind of an interesting timing, right? Like, I can't say for certain that this is what led to it, but there are several people I talked to who thought the fact that he couldn't get them to remove this jet thing is what ultimately led him to build a stake. Now, I don't think he was like, I'm going to buy the company over this, but I think it's very reasonable to think that he was like, I'd love to be a shareholder. And now suddenly they have to listen to me a little bit more than they would otherwise. So those are some interesting reasons.
I am the most powerful man in the world. You will listen to me.
Exactly.
But, it's interesting because Taylor Swift is having the fight now over the jet account, and maybe she'll buy X off of.
Maybe they'll team up.
I think she could afford it better than him. Maybe she's pretty rich, and I don't think she's tied up in a bunch of businesses other than her own, and it's doing really well. So there you go. It wasn't your book. I think I saw the news blurb that he started. Drugs may have been involved in some of these decisions.
So this is, this part is not in the book. There have been rumors about Elon taking drugs ever since I've started covering him.
Really?
You might be shocked.
I've never seen a journalist cover that yet.
Well, the Wall Street Journal had a nice, nice story that came out. So there is a lot of speculation that, some of this could have been fueled by some drug use. I cannot say one way or the other. I'll leave, I'll point people to the journal story and just simply say that these have been sort of whispered loudly around Elon for a long time. I don't know exactly how much it played a role, but it seems like it could have.
Yeah. And do you think he was maybe in some sort of weird dark place? He's kind of riding high on smacking home runs out of the park. Everything's going well, and it's been interesting, and I imagine you've documented this in your book, how it's really spun itself into a real toilet bowl situation and not been the real, I've seen that in business where, some guys can hit home runs for a while, and then, all of a sudden they start hitting, balls and fouls, and it's really hard on them when you're used to hitting home runs all the time because they can't figure it out.
I think there's a great quote from a former executive at Twitter. So it was a woman, her name's Esther Crawford, and she was there when Elon took over. She sort of bought into Elon's, new vision, literally sleeping at the office, trying to like be hardcore for Elon. And she ultimately got fired, as most people end up doing sometimes when they work for Elon. And but she had this great. She tweeted sort of about her experience like months later, and she had this line that was like, Elon's incredibly great at physics-based problems or technically based problems, writing code, for example. But when it comes to a communications platform, when it comes to a platform that requires a lot of soft skills, it requires a different type of emotional intelligence. And I think that's really astute observation, quite frankly. I think there's no doubt that Elon's incredibly smart, that he's obviously had some huge home runs. I'm not sure if the soft skills required to run Twitter are necessarily his strength. Yeah. And I think we're seeing that play out right now in the way that he sort of behaves on Twitter and how it's impacting their business.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, and you know, it's rumored, I guess, that he's on the spectrum in some way or another. And sometimes those social skills are harder for people. You know, most people that are on the spectrum or autistic are savants. I mean, they're really brilliant, smart people, and they can do, you know, they can really do intelligent stuff. And when you see some of the ways that he behaves on and talks, I mean, you know, the interesting thing about social media is people say what's in their head. It's almost like, you know, you used to have to get people drunk and go to the bar to find out what people really thought. But, you know, basically, in fact, back in the day, that used to be the joke in 2011, 2010. We used to tell people Twitter is the bar, Facebook is the home, and LinkedIn is the office. So make sure that you perform in those sort of, you know, don't go on LinkedIn and act like you're on Twitter. Right. You know,
that's a pretty good rundown, actually.
Isn't it? Yeah, that's what we used to teach people. And so we, you know, don't go saying weird shit on LinkedIn, because, you know, you have fun with your career after that. But, you know, and the other thing you get into is you go through how the rise and fall of Donald Trump account. And it's weird, this battle that Twitter kind of seems like it's kind of left leaning. And I suppose that's an interpretation for everybody. And then now it seems to flip to the right wing, you know, and so you dig through all of that, the arc of that curve.
I do, and the Trump years are really compelling to me, just not only because I lived, like, you live it, right, as a citizen of the United States, you sort of live it, but I covered the company during those years as well, and it was really a struggle for them, for Twitter at the time, to figure out what to do with this guy, right, because in a lot of ways, he was, if not breaking the rules, he was certainly walking right up to sort of like these rules they had in place around basic civility, right? Like no bullying people or no harassing people or whatever. And he would sort of challenge these things on a weekly basis. But he's the president of the United States, right? So like you can't just necessarily treat him, or at least they didn't want to treat him in the same way they would treat you or I or any other sort of quote unquote regular user. And so it was really fascinating. You know, the book gets into sort of these internal struggles of what do you do when the most powerful person in the world is constantly sort of like pressuring you to do something about his account. And eventually they break, clearly, right? They ultimately end up banning him. But it took them, you know, 4+ years to get to that point. And it was not an easy decision internally. Like, they spent a lot of time and brain power arguing over how to handle this account. And even the final decision was second guessed after the fact.
Yeah. I mean, I've been suspended on Twitter for far less than anything, you know, some of the right wing has said. And I had my big account suspended because I followed too many people one day. I was building a journalist list, and I was adding, and it kept saying, you know, hey, you're adding too many people per day, you're going to get suspended. And so I stopped doing it. I woke up the next morning and someone was appearing on the podcast as a journalist, and I went and followed them. Account suspended immediately. Wow. And I'm like, I get suspended for that? And this guy, you know, there are terrorists that are still on Twitter. Right. Yeah, it was 100,000 plus account, close to 200,000 people. I built it since 2008, and this is a dumb thing to do. But I was trying to use the service. I was trying to build a list of journalists because that's who we have on the show, and yet these guys are on there, and you know who else is back? Technically, Trump is back. I think he's legal. He can't do much through his contract, and evidently the thing's going to go through for his the FTC or whatever is approving that deal for him to do the bug buyout or transition or whatever the hell that's it. So one of the things that you get into in the book is basically the battle that goes on, because there's a kind of an internal battle for the buyout of it, and Elon kind of sticks right in it in a way that I don't think he realizes. He got himself locked in.
He did, yeah. His timing was quite terrible, and you kind of take like understatement of the century probably there. But you know, people, you know, high level, just for those who may not remember, right? So like Elon shows up, he basically forces Twitter to sell him the company, right? Gives them an offer they can't refuse kind of thing. He's like, we need to do this as fast as possible.
45 million?
Okay, $44 billion.
Yeah.
And then almost immediately, within a couple weeks, he realizes he's sort of locked himself into this terrible deal because the stock market is going down. There's a war in Europe. Inflation is going up, like all these things. And so he tries to back out of the deal and he tries to walk away. And Twitter literally sues him to force the sale, right? They say, you signed a contract.
Yeah.
You can't walk away. We're going to bring you to court and force you to buy this company. So it's just like a really interesting dynamic that you have a company demanding someone acquire them. And, that's what sets off like a summer full of legal disputes and things. And like the book covers all this. It's like one of those things that would almost feel like it's make believe or a movie, right? If it didn't actually happen in real life, but it did. It was really wild. That whole summer of 2022 was a total bizarre thing.
And I think the drop in the market value, it dropped huge. It was like 25 billion that it dropped to in value, didn't it? It was like really
since
bad.
He's taken it over. So, private. So we don't know. There's not like a stock price that we can use to track the value, but some banks, I think Fidelity, for example, has cut the price by more than 50%, right? So they're saying, hey, you paid 44 billion for it. We now think it's worth 16 or 15 billion. It's crazy how much it's dropped in value. And and he still owes as if it's a $44 billion company. So he's really on the hook for a lot of debt right now.
Yeah, and my understanding is the banks that did finance it, they will not open the purse strings again. They're like, no, we're closed, we're done, we've written it down, and we're not loaning any more money.
Yeah, I mean, would you? I don't know. I don't know.
Did you cover in your book, because I know you guys go to print, and so there's all sorts of crazy stuff that will always, I guess, be happening. But did you talk about in your book where he puts up his fingers to Bob Iger sitting in the audience and advertising?
I was able to. I got it in like the conclusion. So basically, the book ends about 3 months after he takes over, but then I put a ton of stuff that had happened as you acknowledged, like you got to turn in a book, and then there's several months before people get to read it, but there's still stuff that's going on. So I put a bunch of that, stuff into a conclusion or an epilogue. But him sitting on stage in New York and telling advertisers to go F themselves was pretty crazy. Was a pretty crazy thing to say. I've never seen anything like it, especially from someone who is asking those people for advertising dollars, right? That's their whole business. So
and he did seem like he was on something at that show.
I don't know. There's been as we talked about, there's speculation. I can't be the one. I'm not going to be the one to say it, but
I'll say it. He seemed like he was on something. I mean, his mannerisms and stuff were really weird. So I'll say it. That's
it would explain it, right? It's like a really bizarre thing to do. Otherwise,
and then now you see, how he's probably trying to raise more money through stocks and where he put Tesla on the thing. And my friends, they bought the Elon worship. They've built idols to him. I think they basically. I don't know. There's a couple of jokes there on fans probably, but they basically idolize him. And so they bought Teslas, and they're left-leaning political people. And so, they've been kind of whole surprised by his right-wing thing. Do you get into what's interesting to me is his fascination with X. And if you followed him like I have and you have and other people who follow Silicon Valley, you know about his right-wing friend and the PayPal mafia and the fallout over X. And X has been kind of like naming a company X or having an idea for a company name X has been like his Citizen Kane moment with Rosebud, where he's just been like regretting never being able to use X. He was kicked out of PayPal over it and regretting it ever since. And it's almost like he's been trying to find a place for this. And this has been his little curmudgeon he's dragged around through some sort of abuse. And now he's painted it onto this turd what he's turned into a turd, in my opinion. I don't know if you go through any of that in your book of where that originates from, and
a little bit.
It's almost like Rosebud, the the sled where he's like, "Where's my rosebud?"
Elon's sort of been fascinated with this idea, as you mentioned, for a long time. I think his first startup was X.com, or one of his first startups was X.com. His son is actually named X. So like he just has this like infatuation with literally the letter X and like creating something around it. But I think more than that, they're now trying quite hard to distance themselves from what Twitter was, right? I think I've kind of said, Twitter's officially dead, and people will be like, "What do you mean? You're tweeting all the time?" And I'm like, well, let me be clear. Like, X still exists and the product still exists, but I think what made Twitter is no longer a thing, and I think that's by design. Like, Elon does not want Twitter to exist anymore. He bought it and buried it, and now he's hoping to rebrand everything and transform everything as this new company, right? And we see that in their messaging and otherwise. So, the product itself is still a thing, but I think it feels different, as you've pointed out. And I think the goal for the company is very different than what Twitter's original goal was. And so, fast forward a year or two, I think it's going to feel even more drastically different than it is today.
I know he's been trying to copy those apps that they have in China, where they basically
everything app.
Yeah, the Everything app. Where, and I guess his fantasy is to do that, and I guess he's instructed the coders to do that. I guess, do you get into that and the possibilities?
A little bit at the end. Yeah, a little bit at the end, but a lot of this is still really new. This stuff has only really started to materialize in the last couple months, but I've covered it at Bloomberg. It's not necessarily in the book. He's trying to get into payments. He's trying to get into this idea of even banking. Like, maybe you would use X to hold money, and they would give you some type of, interest payment. It's really ambitious stuff that I'm not sure will catch on in the US, quite frankly. Like, there's a reason these everything apps are popular in Asia, but have not been able to tack on here in the US. Like, Facebook has tried to do this. They've tried to do this with Messenger. They've tried to do this with WhatsApp. The US market's just really hard for this type of everything app idea. And I'm not convinced he's going to be able to do it, but at least he, I guess if you want to give him credit, he's he's trying to do something different. I don't know. I enjoyed the old Twitter a lot. I've been bummed to see how it's transitioned. So
you and me,
we'll see. I'm skeptical.
You and me. Do you think that maybe some of the motivation is he saw, these billionaires, they love to have their own voice, especially if you're the richest person in the world. And do you think maybe he saw, it's kind of a William Randolph Hearst thing. Remember how Hearst, built all the newspapers, and basically he was a kingmaker in politics, and if you went against his newspaper, or he didn't want you to be king, he was gonna make it so you weren't. And then he saw how Donald Trump used it basically as his bully pulpit, and he's like, hey, I want to have a voice and get my message out. Do you think there's maybe an ego that bought into that?
Yeah, I think it's impossible to ignore that element of it, right? Especially when you are as rich and powerful and famous as he is. There's stories you hear about just like his fascination with his own engagement, right? We saw this with Trump too, watching the likes pour in, right? And I think like there's some element about that with Elon too, is like seeing how widely distributed his own views can become if he uses X. And so I don't know if that was, it's hard to say if that was like the one thing, or if that was just one of many things. I tend to think it's one of many, but I do think it's an element here that you can't ignore, which is that he's become incredibly, incredibly influential and famous even since buying the company.
Yeah, I remember when he was upset. He's like, hey, I'm not getting enough likes and views on my thing, and I own this damn company. And
exactly.
Just like, at this point, I'm just like, has he just written it off as, well, this is my megaphone, and I get to decide this? I'm the decider, I guess. And so I'll just run with it. And it's been really interesting. You can see the influences of Peter Thiel, of course, and Peter Thiel's whole right-wing conservative thing that's been around since he was in Stanford, and his whole slants on stuff, and the influence. I believe it was Peter Thiel and a couple of his other right-wing friends that actually helped push Elon into the deal, right?
David Sachs is one who is the PayPal guy who's been super involved. Some of the Tesla board members and the SpaceX board members have sort of been advisors for him. But there's no doubt that he has, and Elon said this as well, he's politically shifted. I think he used to be left, if not maybe center left, and now he would say he's sort of center right, but I think he's quite clearly pretty right, pretty conservative in terms of like the things he's tweeting about, right, with immigration probably being like the one big one that he keeps talking about with the border crisis and things like that. So it's been interesting to see it be, and the one thing that Twitter does better for good or bad is it's public, man. So like we're seeing this evolution sort of happen in front of our very eyes because we see everything he tweets.
There you go. And the billionaire public square is really what it's become since Donald Trump, I think. Yeah. Where it's, and they just crowd everyone out. Maybe Taylor Swift will buy it next, and I just hope she's as sweet as she always seems to come across as being. But I don't know, maybe she'll take her whole army of Swifties and she'll shut down the Jet account that everyone hates, I guess. And then she'll I don't know, help the Chiefs wins the next Super Bowl, whatever the conspiracy thing is. Yeah, so I think it's great. You document all this stuff. You get into the details of it, and look, I'm sure you'll have plenty of data for book 2.
I know some people have been like, "Oh, what are you going to just pick up where you left off?" I'm like, I need to sleep for about two years before I can even consider. Like this, so. I
mean, it's going to be an endless thing. I refuse to call it X, and then everything comes across. The emails still come out as Twitter. For the longest time, I couldn't find the app because I'm like, where's the Twitter app? And I couldn't find it because I'm used to looking for the bird for the last 12, 20, whatever years, and so you're just and then who's it? The infamous writer for horror got into it. He's like, I'm still calling it Twitter.
Oh yeah, Stephen King. Yeah,
Stephen King. It's just so, and you sit and you watch some of his tweets and you're like, dude, you're like the richest person on the earth. Do you not have something better to do? And then you see how it does affect Tesla stock. It really took the game off him too. Everybody thought that he was this home run king and infallible and everything else. And talk about ruining your image. Like nothing else.
Yeah, I think a lot of people. You mentioned sort of your friends who were Elon fans and have been sort of surprised. I mean, like, I think there are a ton of people out there who maybe knew who Elon was, right? Like they certainly knew, oh, he's the Tesla guy or the SpaceX guy, but they didn't really know much about him. And the Twitter takeover has really broadcasted his personality, but also his personal views to just so many people who I don't think really were aware of the type of person that he was. And I think there's a lot of people who have sort of like been like, oh, he's different. He's different than I expected or like that I certainly anticipated.
Yeah, he's kind of on the downside like Donald Trump is, where everything's going wrong now. So I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see how it turns out. But like you said, I was really, I still have a romance with the old bird, even though it was a clown car, a shit show for most of its years. But there you go. So final thoughts as we go out. Kurt, tell people where to buy the book and your .coms and find you on the interwebs.
Yeah. Thank you again for having me. The book is called Battle for the Bird. It just came out yesterday, so this thing is fresh. And I would just say, you don't even have to really know or care about Twitter, I think, to find this story interesting. If I do say so myself, it's really a story. It's like, you'll read some of this stuff and just be like, I can't believe that this is how a business was run, or I can't believe that this is how the richest person in the world sort of makes decisions or behaves. It's just like I think it's like an interesting business story, regardless of how you feel about Twitter. So I hope people will, give it a shot.
There you go. And someone in the audience is asking, is it on Audible yet? It is on Amazon. Is. You can order it there.
Yep.
And all that good stuff. And so thank you very much, Kirk, for coming on. We really appreciate it, man. All right. And get some sleep, buddy.
I know. I got 2 little kids too, so it doesn't happen all that often.
You got to do all this book promotion stuff now. So there you go. Continued success, my friend. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for getting it now. Someone's picking you right up off Audible.
That's amazing. Thank you.
Thanks to our audience for tuning in. Go to goodreads.com for Chris Voss, LinkedIn.com for Chris Voss, all those crazy places on the internet. And we're also on Twitter, or X, on the Chris Voss Show 1, because the Chris Voss Show got suspended friending too many people. But God knows we should put Donald Trump and who's the guy who did the Sandy Sandy Hook conspiracy crap. He's back on there, and I'm like,
Jones.
We can't get the show back on, but it makes no sense to me. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Be good to each other. Stay safe, and we'll see you guys next time.